Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are finally here, and in addition to all the new Pokemon, there's a ton of new items that have varying usefulness. I thought it'd be fun to go through and tell you which items I think are great and which items, maybe less so. Coming in at last place, we have the Ability Shield. So this item is funny because what it does is it prevents your Pokemon from having its ability changed. The truth of the matter is that while yes, sometimes a Pokemon's ability will change, it's not so common, and most of the time you can reset your ability by just switching out. So having an item that protects against it really just isn't that high value, especially because it probably doesn't happen in more than, like, being generous, 20% of matches. On top of that, a lot of Pokemon have abilities where they only activate on switch in, and Pokemon with unique abilities like Mimikyu can't have them changed in the first place. So overall, I think this item just really isn't very good, and I would almost never consider it, except on maybe a really specific use case that I can't even think of right now. Next up, we have the loaded dice. Now, this is a fun item. I think it's really cool conceptually, and basically what it does is it says, okay, if your Pokemon uses a move that can hit, multiple times, normally these moves hit 2 to 5 times, you have a higher likelihood of hitting more times. Typically, these moves are weighted so that they hit 2 or 3 times. With the loaded dice, they're weighted so they hit 4 or 5 times most often. This is a really cool concept, but the fact of the matter is that it's just not that valuable. Most of these multi-hit moves are really pretty weak, and so most of the individual hits are at most 25 base power. So, if you hit 3 more times than you normally would, which is the maximum, yes, you are doing 75 more base power, but most of the time you're probably hitting 1 or 2 more times, which is 25 to 50 base power, and it's not even guaranteed that you even get the value out of the item, and so it's just not that big a deal. The thing about items is you really want to make sure that they're providing value. Not all of the value has to be enormous. Some items like Citrus Berry, they give you 25% health back, which isn't like that much at the end of the day, but it is, a lot, and it's pretty, on a lot of Pokemon, it will activate most of the time. But something like this, you're better off with like a Life Orb or a choice item, even honestly like a type boosting item like Charcoal could be better because at least you get guarantee. The thing about the loaded dice right now is I would pretty much never consider using it because every Pokemon that uses multi-hit moves probably has a better item that is a little bit more consistent, so you don't even have to gamble in the first place. Okay, our next item is the first one that I think actually you could consider using under certain conditions. It is the Punching Glove. This new item raises the power of punching moves and protects the user from direct contact with the target. So these are abilities like Flame Body, which can burn a Pokemon if it makes direct contact with the target. Also, the item Rocky Helmet does a little bit of damage when a Pokemon makes direct contact. That's the same for Rough Skin. There's a couple negative effects that can happen when you make direct contact with a target. Punching Glove not only protects you from that, but it also gives you a power boost as well, which is overall not so bad. There's an item actually introduced in Sword and Shield that, to my knowledge, nobody used. It's called the Protective Pads, and it's basically an item that protects the user from direct contact for all physical moves, not just punching moves, but it's just not that much of a use case. The Punching Glove probably wouldn't be used if it was just this Protective Pads effect, but the fact that it gives you a damage boost as well, I think is worth considering. Now, do I think it's good? Nah, not really. Like, I think it could be okay on the right Pokemon, but there's probably a use case where you actually do want to use this item, and that's frankly more than we can say about anything else that's been on this list so far. Like, there's probably some Pokemon who like would want like a damage boost anyway, and the fact that this also gives them like a protection against contact is like pretty nice. I don't think it's the best item ever, but I also think that it could theoretically get used on some Pokemon. Okay, next up is the first item that was revealed before the game's released, called the Mirror Herb. Basically, the way the item works is that once your opponent raises their stats, or if your Pokemon switches in and the opponent has a stat boost, the item will be consumed and you will get whatever their boosted stats are. The thing about this is that most of the time it's pretty inconsistent. Like, your opponent isn't always going to boost their stats, and imagine you have a special attacker and you switch in front of like a physical attacker, right? Like, it's not that good at the end of the day and it feels pretty random. Or maybe you have a slow Pokemon and they boost their speed. There's just a lot of ways in which this item can not really work out. What I will say though, and the reason why I put it this high on the list, is that there are certain ways that you can manipulate this item to ensure that it works out positively. I think the clearest case is with the move Swagger, which raises the opponent's attack stat by 2 stages and confuses them. What you could do, for example, is use Swagger on a special attacker, a Pokemon that doesn't even use its physical attack stat, raise its attack 2 stages, and then have your Mirror Herb Pokemon get that +2 attack boost without having to worry about confusion. It's not perfect by any means, and of course, if your opponent has 2 physical attackers on the field, you might not be able to use it, but it does have some use, and you can give it some setup here. Kind of like the Punching Glove, I don't think that this item is going to be game-breaking. I don't think it's going to be super popular. To me, it kind of feels like a gimmick more than anything else. But even though the Punching Glove doesn't feel like a gimmick in the same way that this item does, the Mirror Herb to me feels like it has a higher ceiling. Like, there might be some kind of wild combination that you can pull off that you know, I just don't have enough experience with the game yet to identify. So I don't expect it to be especially popular, but I do think that it has some uses, and I'm really curious to see if anybody finds out like a really creative way of using it. Number 3 goes to the booster energy item. Now, this item is unique on this list because it's the only item that can even be utilized by certain Pokemon. The booster energy is only usable on Paradox Pokemon who have a specific ability. Basically, what booster energy does is upon switching in, it raises the Pokemon's highest stat and then is consumed. So it's a once per battle effect. Now, raising a Pokemon's highest stat is really good, especially on powerful Pokemon like the Paradox Pokemon already are. The thing is, you can only use this effect once per battle. And if you find yourself having to switch out immediately, you're basically playing down an item. The other thing worth noting is that you can also activate these abilities under different conditions. You don't need the booster energy to actually activate them. For the Paradox Pokemon found in Pokemon Scarlet, you can activate it with the harsh sunlight, and for those found in Violet, you can use electric terrain. Obviously, there will be some Paradox Pokemon where you don't want to have sun or electric terrain on the team, or you can't really afford it, and for those Pokemon, I think booster energy is definitely a good alternative, but because it's not necessary, I'm not putting it any higher. I want to be clear that this is still a good item and that you should definitely still consider using it. A +1 stat boost is very valuable, especially on offensive Pokemon or on fast Pokemon, so much so that the choice items are often used to give that kind of +1 effect at the cost of not letting you switch your moves. This is a very good item. I don't think it's the only item that we'll see on Paradox Pokemon, and I'm really excited to see kind of that balance between players who are activating these abilities with the booster energy versus those players who are activating the ability with the harsh sunlight and electric terrain. Before we get into the top 2, I just want to take a moment and ask you to consider subscribing to the channel. Currently, only 12% of my viewers are subscribed, and I think that it's mutually beneficial because I'm putting out a lot of good content around getting better at Pokemon, and presumably that's something that you care about. Or maybe you just like watching these videos because they're entertaining. Regardless, I'm really trying to hit 1 million subscribers, and I could really use your help in doing so. Also, thanks for watching the video. It really means a lot. Okay, now we are into the top 2, and these two, in my opinion, have a ton of potential. I really like both of these remaining 2 items because they really fundamentally change the way the game is played, which is not always the case for a lot of items. Starting with number 2, we have the Covert Cloak. This item is really interesting, and it basically gives the holder the shield dust effect, which shields them from the additional effects of damaging moves. Basically, some moves have a secondary effect, a chance to do something other than damage. This is stuff like Thunderbolt paralyzing, Flamethrower burning, Rock Slide flinching. It's worth noting that it doesn't block these effects when they're used by non-damaging moves. So something like Sleep Powder would still put you to sleep, Will-O-Wisp would still burn you, stuff like that. But Fake Out, which is a damaging move technically, but not really used for damage, it would block that. Fake Out for many years was kind of the best move in the game. It did fall off a little bit with Sword and Shield. That's largely because Dynamax Pokemon were immune to Fake Out, but especially as we get better and better Fake Out users like Incineroar and Rillaboom, it only gets more and more prevalent. Having an item that can shield you from Fake Out is a pretty big deal, and there's a lot of Pokemon who would like to set up or would just like to do more damage that would really appreciate not being affected by Fake Out. The fact that this also blocks against other secondary effects like freeze, burn, off random moves, etc., is a pretty big deal. Now, I don't think this is the kind of item that's going to be on every team, but I do think that there's some Pokemon that can really make good use of it, and I'm really excited to see what players come up with when they're looking at this item. So we'll have to check back in and see how well it's doing once players have had some time to kind of get comfortable and start figuring out which Pokemon want to use what items. Last but not least, the single best item they're adding this generation is looking very good. It is the Clear Amulet. This item is straight up broken. It basically gives the holder clear body by preventing its stats from being lowered by opponents' attacks or abilities. This is bonkers. In Generation 8, players figured out that the item White Herb, which will reset a Pokemon's stats once they're dropped, was actually so good that it was worth running on many teams competing at the World Championships. So to better understand Clear Amulet, you have to understand that this is like White Herb every single turn, like forever. Your stats can never get lowered from your opponent. This is a really big deal because moves and abilities that lower your stats are everywhere in competitive Pokemon. I would say that being kind of conservative with the estimate, about 80% of teams at least have a Pokemon with the ability Intimidate, which lowers your attack stat upon switching in. The amount of value you can get out of this item, especially on physical attackers who are normally checked by Intimidate, is just, it's absurd. Like, this is going to totally change the way that Pokemon games play out. If this item isn't on most teams, I would be extremely shocked because it's just so good. Physical attackers have always been good, but they've been kept in check by Intimidate just because it's such a good ability and so many good Pokemon learn it. There hasn't really been counterplay for physical attackers to Intimidate for like ever. You could use the White Herb, but it can only be used one time, and since Intimidate activates every time a Pokemon switches in, the opponent could just switch out and switch back in, or even worse, they could Parting Shot out, lower your stats, and then come back in again. There hasn't really been a good way to stop Intimidate for many years, until now. I personally think that this is totally going to change the dynamic of competitive Pokemon, and I think we're going to see a lot more physical attackers because of how good this item is. I think this item is especially good on physical attackers that are already boosting their stats, like with Swords Dance or especially Dragon Dance, but I'm sure there's other use cases as well. And that's how I rank every new item in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching.